Hello, this is Damnesia and welcome back to another tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to go over methods as stated in the previous tutorial. And because this is not the first tutorial in the series, I'm not going to go into too much of the details that I went into last tutorial. I'm going to have to assume that people have watched that, and if people haven't, then I suggest watching that one first. Let's create a new Java tutorial project. This one is number 4. And close the previous one. In this tutorial we're going to go over methods, so first thing we want to do is create a new package. We're going to call this pack1, and you'll get to know why in a second. And then inside this, click on the actual package and click here. And this one we're going to call main. And we're going to take this public static void main. So in this tutorial we're going to figure out what this means. The public static void main is a method in itself. It's called the main method, and it's the first one that Java runs. When it sees it, this is the one that Java executes. And from this one you can call other methods as well. So let's first figure out how to create a method. As you can see here, it says public. Same thing with classes, but classes will be for next tutorial. But anyways, first thing is the visibility. In this case, public. I'm going to write private here to show that that's another option. Right? And you've got the following options. I'm going to write them up over here. You've got public, private, and protected. And then you've got no visibility modifier. And visibility modifiers are basically this thing. If you say public or private or protected, that's a visibility modifier. When I say no visibility modifier, I mean if you completely leave this out. And this in itself is something called a friendly visibility modifier. Alright, so first things first is private. So we've added that. Now the next word I'm not going to explain yet, so you're just going to have to take my word for it. Just write static. And I'll explain it in the next tutorial when we go over classes. And then the next thing is your return type. I'm just going to write void, and we'll get to what the return type means later. And then obviously the name of it. I'm going to call this method1, open bracket and close brackets. And that's how you specify method. Now I'm going to open up curly brackets and close the curly brackets like that. Same as over here. You can put the space if you want. Once again, Java doesn't care about spaces, so that doesn't matter. Next, we want to do something inside here. And I'm just going to go with a simple print line. I'm going to say this is method1. Now inside here, we're going to call the method. We usually call it, when you call one method from another one, we usually say we call that method. We make it run. So in order to do that, we need to run it like this. So all you need to do is take the name over here, as we've done, and then put the open and closing brackets, and then don't forget the semicolon right there. Now if you run the program, you'll see it outputs, this is method1. So now this is quite useful if you have repetitive things happening. So if you have some piece of code that's happening in multiple places that has a sole purpose, then you can put the code inside a method and then call it instead of recoding the entire thing. This isn't exactly the same as a for loop, because for loop just means repeat the same thing until. But a method basically means do this, and whenever you want to do it later on, you can do it again by just calling it again. So we can do method 1, then we can do stuff here, and I'm not going to do anything there because you get the point, and then call method 1 over here. So you'll see that it will do stuff. I'll just write out a line that says stuff, and then you'll see this is method 1, it'll say stuff, and then next line, this is method 1. That's basically what a method is for, to be able to call a piece of code from wherever you want without having to recode it in there. So now when you have a one-line thing where you're calling over here, it might be kind of pointless to have a method for that. So if your method ends up being just one line, it's probably preferred to actually just, instead of the method call, just put in this, because that's effectively what it's doing. But we're assuming that you have more stuff to do in the code. So that's what you do when you have a specific piece of code that needs to do something. And each and every method, it's good practice to have them each have a single purpose instead of some random that and that and that. Although the main method is pretty much that kind of purposeless method. But in general, we say every method needs to have a function, a clear function. And the main simply has a function of starting the application. You don't need to call this main method. The application will automatically call it when it needs to. Now let's get to more visibility modifiers. Now you can see that private didn't make it private to here, because we can still read it. So what does private mean? Well, you'll only be able to really understand this in the next tutorial when we go into classes. But currently private means only visible in this class. In other words, in between this and this, it's visible. You'll not be able to call it from anywhere else if you create another class. And we'll get to creating classes in the next tutorial, so this may be a little bit of a weird thing to think about right now. But you'll understand it soon enough. Public equals visible everywhere in this project. And the project is this. This is a project. That file over here is the entire project. So public basically just means visible everywhere in this project. And if you compile it and add it into another project, you'll be able to use it from there as well. So public is basically the most non-restrictive visibility modifier. And then there's friendly, which just means no modifier. And this one basically just means it's visible within the package. So basically what happens is, if I go over here, you'll see that this is just a simple folder, and that's what it's called, a package. And if we create a new package, we say pack2, you'll see that you created a new folder, and now it's empty. So what we do is, don't worry about understanding this code so far, I'm just going to create something. Don't worry about this code yet. We'll get to what this means in a bit. But right now I just want to create a new class so I can show you the idea of what friendly means. And protected's a little bit more complex, and we'll probably get to that in tutorial number 8. Alright, so I created a method 2. And now I want to call main dot. And as you can see, I am not able to call this method 1. It won't be possible to see method 1 because it's private. If I remove this access modifier, method 1 will still not want to be visible, because friendly basically means within the package you'll be able to see it, but not from outside the package, which is useful sometimes. If you want to have just a bunch of things inside a single folder that can only be seen within that folder, like this one. And then there's the public. And the public will be visible over here, so you'll see there's no problem reading it. So basically, we get the friendly, which means not visible outside this package. We get the private, which means not visible outside this class. And we get public, which is just non-restrictive, visible within this entire project. We didn't really call method 2, and as I can tell you, method 2 will not be accessible in this way because it's in a different place. But once again, that will be taught later. Just follow the same kind of conventions. You'll see you also need to import packages, and then you'll import it like this. You'll take the folder, just like you have this package over here. You'll just say import, and then pack2, which is this, dot, which means anything inside pack2, and code is the name of the class inside here. Now we'll be able to access anything within code. That's extra, and you don't really have to understand that yet. We'll get to more about this later, and it will get more complex than this. But this is a basic, simple use case. So as you can see, this thing calls method 1. So we'll basically be calling method 1. So we'll jump over here. It will call this is method 1. It will say this is method 1, print it out to the terminal, and then do some stuff, whatever you want it to do. Then it will jump back here and then start running the rest of the code. It will hit this and it will output stuff onto the terminal. And then it will continue and hit this. It will jump back over here, run this is method 1 and output to the terminal. Do whatever stuff was there and then jump all the way back over here and then continue from here. Then it runs to code.method2. Now it knows we have imported pack2.code, and you only need to import if it's a different package, but we'll get to that later. It will jump all the way over here to this class called code, and it will check what's inside code. Like I said, code dot. The dot means inside, and then it will call method 2, which is the method inside code. And that's basically how you call that method. Next, we'll get to something else that's quite useful as well. There's another way of running this. Just remember to start your thing with public static again. Don't worry about what static means. And now we're going to go over what this void means. Now in a void method, we're going to, and by the way, don't worry about this and that. Don't collide because they're in different classes. So there's no problem with that. But anyways, I'm just going to quote method 3 for ease of understanding. Otherwise, people might think I'm calling that one, but I'm actually calling this one. So basically what void means is this is what this method gives back. So basically what happens is if you have some kind of a calculation that you need to do, like I'm going to include parameters in here as well. So this is the method name, right? The name of the method. Then inside these brackets, as you can see, there's a string array args. This is basically a string. And I believe I did teach it in tutorial 1, so I'm not going to go over that too much. This is basically what this method receives from the caller. So if we want to do method 3 and we want to say, we want to add two integers together. We want to add int a and int b. And by the way, the names of these two do not matter at all. All that matters is basically what data is being sent into the first and what data is being sent into the second. These are just names for the first and name for the second, so that the method knows how to refer to it when it needs to use them. So in order to do a return, we basically write, and this is quite simple, the word return. So we are returning something. What are we returning? Well, let's return a plus b. This is the sum of the two numbers. But of course this is not going to work because we have void right here. So what does void mean? And before I'm going to just comment it out so I don't have to rewrite. Void basically means there's no return value. Nothing at all. You can't return anything from it. So the way you can actually return something from here is by doing this. And there's nothing returned. This basically means just close the method. The first return statement it reaches is where the statement goes back down. So if you go and call method 3 with parameter, with the first parameter and the second parameter, so 12 will be saved into A, and then A will be used over here. 13 will be saved into B, and B will be used over here. But right now we're not doing anything with that. But I'm just sending it in because we said that we have to send those two values in. And it's a comma over here, by the way. And those are the data types. So now what happens here is there's no return method. So let's say that we call a system.out.println and then output to a value of A, and then in the second part we'll output the value of B. Eclipse is quite a clever IDE. So the IDE automatically recognizes that this will never happen, because this return statement is basically where the method ends. So basically it will run this and everything that's happening over here, and then we'll hit here. Once it hits here, it returns nothing, and then goes back over here. So nothing that happens afterwards will happen. So that's a quick way of running out of a method. So if you ever have a situation where if A is less than 0, for example, then we can return. And by the way, in the method where it says void, you don't actually have to call a return, which is why this is an optional way of doing it. And basically if you say if A is less than 0, then return. In other words, if A is less than 0, jump out of this method and don't continue with this code. So in this scenario, it will run both system.out.println. As you can see, A is 12 and B is 13. But if A is less than 0, like -1, then you'll see A is -1, but then hit over here and it returned over here. And nothing happened afterwards. This return statement is where the method ended. Right, so that's an interesting way of using return statements in a situation of a void. But there are situations where a return method is always needed. Like if you don't have a void, if you have int, for example, you're returning an integer value, then you need to return something. So in this case, I'm returning A plus B, and I'm going to delete this because unnecessary. And what happens here is it returns A, and then A plus B, which is this calculation over here. I'm going to put it in brackets to make it simpler to understand. So we basically do this. We send in -1 into A and 13 into B. Then we do -1 plus 13, which is 12. And then we return the value. Return an int. So we need to save the value. Int A equals. And this A has nothing to do with this A, because they're completely different scopes. This A only exists within this method, and this A only exists within this method. And if you were to have a static int x, and you try to use, actually I'm going to name it B, just so I don't have to change anything. And as you can see, this B and this B are the same, except for some reason it still knows to use this B in here and not this B. And the reason for that is because it uses the one that's been made in the parameter list, which basically just overrides it. So this still exists, but for the purpose of this method, you're not actually accessing this one, you're actually accessing this one. If you still want to access this one for whatever reason, you can do it like this. And I'm just putting it in the system.out.println so I can show that it works. Main, which is our class main, dot B. and b being this value right here. Right, so now we've used the other b instead of the b that's written over here. And if this b wasn't overriding it, like if it said x, then this would automatically know to use this one instead. But because we are overwriting it, this b will use this b, and main.b, if you want to call it, we'll call this b. If I delete this part of the code, it doesn't really matter too much. Next, what you can see is I've saved what this thing returns, in other words, the return value, from method 3 into a. Now let's show what the value of a is, so you can see why this is useful. So now I've outputted, actually I'm going to write sum here because it makes more sense. And it says sum equals 12. And that's obviously minus 1 plus 13, which is 12. So this value is basically just a sum of the two. And if you wanted to put a multiplication over there, you can change it to value so it makes sense. It says negative 13 because negative 1 times 13. And if you were to change the two values, like negative 1 here and 13 over here, it wouldn't make any difference unless the order of operation matters. So for example, instead of a equaling to negative 1 like it did before, a is now the one that's equal to 13, and b is now the one that's equal to negative 1. So they basically just swapped values by doing that. And just to drive the point even further, int b equals 5, int a equals 3, and I'll actually name this one. Alright, and now what we're going to do is we're going to put a b over here and an a over here. So as you can see, there's an a over here, and an a over here, and then a b over here, and a b over here. Now a lot of people get confused, and for some reason believe that this b will be saved into this b, just because their names are the same. But that's actually not the case. They'll be saved according to the order that you've given them. So b is the first one you've given, so it'll be the first parameter, and a is the second one you've given, so it'll be the second parameter. And that's how it will be saved. So in order to drive the point home, I'm going to do a minus b, because that one does matter which order. So it'll basically be the value of b is saved into a, and the value of b was 5. So 5 minus 3, and then we can just output the value 2 right here. So this may confuse some people because the b and the a are swapped around, but it really doesn't matter. This way around, this b over here, which is equal to 3, will be passed into a. So a will equal to 3. And then this a, which is equal to 5, will be saved into b. So b will equal to 5. So 3 minus 5, which is negative 2. But I'm not here to do math. So that's basically how you do a return value. And you can use any of the primitive types and even non-primitive types, but I'll get to those later. So I'm just going to return a value like a Boolean, just to show that you can do that too. And what I'm going to use is what I used from the previous tutorial, just to show. And I'm going to put this like that. So instead of having a return statement like this, where you can have, and you can do this if you want, if a is less than b, return true, and then else return false. Instead of doing that, we can abuse the fact that this if statement returns a true, and this value is a true. So basically this will evaluate the true, and if this evaluates false, then we return false. So this will be the same value as what we return. So we can literally just shorten it to this. And the reason why there's an error is because it will never reach this. You can see that there's an if, and it sees that whatever happens, if the else statement runs, then it returns a false. So this will never run, because it will either return this one or this one with no exceptions. Okay, but there's other things that we can actually do. So An interesting way of thinking about this is like this. If you have an if statement that says if A is less than B, return true, we can abuse the return statement, which is where the method ends, as you may have already remembered. And then if this method returns true, then this method won't continue with any of the code afterwards, so this part will not run. Therefore, we can abuse that and just put it like that, so return true, and then we don't have to put an else statement. We can just return false outside the if statement, and it will act as if it's an else statement, because if this happens, then it won't reach this part. But if it doesn't happen, then it will reach this part. So that's another way of doing it as well. But the simplest and best way to do it in this case, as we've done a really simple kind of method, is to simply have it like this. We're returning if A is less than B, which, depending on which values we pass in, might be true, might be false. And then obviously, because we're returning Boolean, we can't save it into an int anymore. We have to set it into Boolean. And then you can see value equals true, because obviously we've set them to the right values. And in this case, it will be false, because 5 is not less than 3. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over classes, and it's going to get a little bit more complex, so make sure you understand this. And if you don't, just make sure you practice, because this is really important stuff for the rest of the tutorials. And you'll be using this over and over. So leave a like and comment if you enjoyed it. So for now, this is it for this tutorial, and see you in the next tutorial.